This is part 3 in a 3-part series on kVp and medical imaging, what it is, what we use it for, the expectations that we have whenever we adjust kVp, increase or decrease. Generally, whenever I'm talking about changes in a technical factor, I'll only go in one direction, so it's assumed that the opposite change would have the opposite effect. So I use the increase in kVp in this case, or I will use an increase in kVp in this case to describe what happens whenever we increase kVp. Just know that a decrease does the same thing. Since this is the third in the 3-part series, I'm not going to go all the way back through everything, but I am going to talk about I'm going to review the expectations and what we say happens in each one. There's not a whole lot of new content at the end of this. It's just the other miscellaneous things that happen whenever we adjust our kVp. So just getting down to it, that's the first part of this was about the X-ray circuit and what happens whenever we increase kVp and how the circuit responds, or where we control our kVp in our circuit. So our first claim was kVp has more effect than any other factor on our technique and on our X-ray production, emission, and interaction with the patient. And that is absolutely true. It increases the area under the brim spectrum, so it increases dramatically how many X-ray photons that we create. It also pushes the average towards the high energy side, meaning we get a more penetrating X-ray beam. It increases the peak energy, also making sure that we get a more penetrating X-ray beam. So it changes the imaging characteristics of the X-ray beam, and what I mean by that is that we're more likely to penetrate the patient as opposed to having photoelectric interactions. All interactions, as we'll see later on, go down, but what we get though is an increase in scatter penetrated through the patient incident on the image receptor. So it increases penetrability of the beam, changing the imaging characteristics, changing the likelihood that any given photon penetrates, including scatter radiation, and it decreases chances of photoelectric absorption very, very much. It increases if we have a characteristic that would be your discrete spectrum, remembering that that's only at 69 kVp. So if you set your controls at 68 kVp, you're not going to have a recognized characteristic spectrum at 69 kVp. It exponentially increases the number of photons in the remnant beam. So even though we increase kVp a little bit, it increases the number that we create. What's more significant is what comes through the patient and what is post-patient. So it changes everything with the exception of what filtration changes. So the filtration changes where we start our minimum, but with the change in kVp, we get an increase in height. Pushes towards the high energy side, we get an increase in peak energy, and then it determines again whether or not we have a characteristic spectrum. If either one of these spectra ended right here, we would not have a characteristic spectrum. So that was the first claim, and we went through in the first video why some of that stuff was confusing. Claim 2 was increasing kVp increases patient dose, and that is absolutely true. In the diagnostic range, if you don't change anything else, then you're going to increase the patient dose, and that is because as you increase your kVp, you increase the output from the X-ray tube, so you get all of these extra X-ray photons interacting inside of the patient. So remembering that the average energy is 1/3 roughly the peak energy. If this was a 90 kVp X-ray beam, then our average would be at 30. So we're going to have a lot of absorption of those low energy photons and even the average energy photons. So we do see an increase in dose with an increase in kVp. Since an increase in kVp increases output from the X-ray tube, then the dose will increase. In our example, to keep it simple, dose might increase by roughly about 30%. We use those numbers later on. So claim number 3, a 15% increase in kVp equals a doubling of the mass. That's true in context. It's not completely true. What we get with a 15% increase in kVp is we truly do get an increase in tube output, but where the change is most significant is post-patient. The effect of doubling the kVp at the image receptor is the same as doubling the mass, but it does not really equate to a doubling of the mass as far as tube current and the output from the X-ray tube goes. So doubling of mass means doubling the tube current and a doubling of photons created. We don't see that with a change in kVp. If we double the number of electrons we send across the tube, we double the number of photons. And again, we don't see that. With a 15% increase in kVp, we don't double tube output. The change will, however, have the same effect at the image receptor. So as we increase kVp, again, the penetration of the beam increases. The effect on the remnant beam then is the same as doubling of the mass, or more specifically, the effect at the image receptor is the same as doubling the mass. So the 15% increase doubles the image receptor exposure, but not the production or even the patient exposure. So number 4, kVp can be used to change image receptor exposure, and that's absolutely true. Since an increase in kVp increases penetration and it increases output from the X-ray tube, if we wanted to change our image receptor exposure by a factor of 2, let's say we made an exposure on the patient and we underexposed the patient, and we needed to repeat and we needed to increase the image receptor exposure by a factor of 2, then what we would do is use a 15% change in kVp without doing anything else. So we would increase kVp by 15% and leave mass the same. So where you would see this in a test question would be just that. It would be, the test question would say something to the effect that you needed to increase image receptor exposure without changing mass, or possibly you needed to increase the image receptor exposure without doubling patient. You needed to double image receptor exposure without doubling patient exposure. Then you would increase your kVp. So your patient exposure is going to go up with an increase in kVp, but it's not going to be a factor of 2. Your image receptor exposure, the effect on the image receptor, is going to be the same as increasing your mass by a factor of 2, though. A 15% change will double the exposure at the image receptor. So this seems to contradict our previous. An increase in kVp decreases patient dose, and that's true in context. So what we're talking about here is what we refer to as a 15% rule. If you increase your kVp by 15% and reduce your mass by a factor of 2, cut it in half, and that's reducing it by 50% or reducing it to 50% of what it was before, then your patient dose will actually decrease. So if you look at the previous videos, I ran through some numbers, and I'll leave that up to you to kind of go back through. So claim 6, as kVp increases, all interactions decrease, and that is true. All interactions do decrease, but you need to understand the specifics and the full story of how that happens and what the net result is. So even though all interactions decrease, what's emitted from the patient doesn't necessarily reflect that. So as you increase your kVp, and if you do nothing else, then you increase the output from the X-ray tube, you increase the number of photons at all levels, including those low energy X-ray photons. So those low energy photons, as you increase kVp, you're going to get an increase in interaction with those low energy X-ray photons. So what this is referring to then are those upper end X-ray photons that are more likely to penetrate through the patient. So if you double the number of, or you increase, let's take doubling out of the equation, but if you increase the number of low energy X-ray photons that would have no chance of getting through the patient to begin with, then they're still not going to make it through the patient. So if you had 15 and you created 20 that would not make it through the patient, then your interaction actually went up. But at those higher energy levels, on a percentage basis, as you increase kVp, then all interactions do go down. So those higher energy X-ray photons, and even those in the average energy range, are more likely to penetrate through the patient and cause less interactions inside of the patient. So the added higher energy photons, those that are pushed towards the high energy side, and certainly that upper register in our example before, what's from 72 to 82 kVp, those from 72 to 82 kVp absolutely will have a greater likelihood of penetration without any kind of interaction. So it's true, with a certain context. So how you're going to look for questions that might be asking about this would be look for in your answer choices, look for contradictions, look for correct statements within context. So if you had a test question that said as you increase kVp, all interactions decrease, then or if the test question asked, as kVp increases, what happens with interactions inside of the patient? So what you would look for would be things like all interactions decrease. Well, that would be a true statement. Scatter increases. Well, that's true within context of scatter penetration through the patient. Scatter creation does not increase, so that would be a false statement. So scatter creation does not increase. Scatter penetration does increase. So what you might look for is, as kVp increases, all interactions decrease, but also look for other possible answers in there too, and also look and see if it's a multiple answer type question with something like all the above or some but not all the above. So all interactions decrease, yes, but what you get is more penetration. So sometimes your test questions may be asking a little bit deeper and asking about not just interactions inside of the patient, but penetration through the patient incident on the image receptor. So this kind of illustrates that as kVp increases, then your compton scatter doesn't change just a whole lot. It does decrease with increased kVp, but it does not change just a tremendous amount. So it does decrease as kVp goes up, but what we get though is a greater penetration through. So as kVp increases, yes, all interaction types decrease. Photoelectrics, though, decrease at a much more rapid rate, and then we can see that in our chart here. At low kVp, we get a lot of photoelectric absorption, and at high kVp, it's very low. You increase the number of photons at all levels, you increase the average. All the x-rays you create before interact exactly like they would have before, and therefore you're going to get an increase in raw number of absorptions, but your percentage is going to decrease. So the higher energy photons created with increased kVp are more likely to penetrate through the patient, and the added higher energy photons are more likely to penetrate without interaction. So the claim number 7, increasing kVp increases scatter, and again that's true in context. As kVp goes up, all interactions decrease, but what we get in the remnant beam is more penetration without any kind of interaction inside of the patient, but we also get higher energy scatter creation that penetrates through the patient as well. So is it true? Is it false? And the answer is yes, it's both. It's true and it's false. We get a lower rate of creation of scatter, just a little bit, but we also get a greater rate of penetration of scatter. So the scatter in the remnant beam actually increases even though the scatter creation decreased. So just a little bit. So as kVp increases, all interactions decrease, leaving a more penetrating X-ray beam. Photoelectrics decrease more rapidly than Comptons, meaning that we have a higher percentage of Comptons compared to photoelectrics. So what you'll hear that referred to as the Compton to PE ratio, a lot of times shortened just to PE ratio. So the PE ratio changes, we get more scattered photons, less photoelectrics, and therefore in context is true in that context. So the remnant beam is composed of both unattenuated photons and Compton scatter photons that now have the energy to exit the patient's body and strike the image receptors. So a lot of quotes for that because it's really, really complicated. And I'd refer you back to the other videos that I did, parts 1 and parts 2, to kind of get that. So then we get to the other stuff, other considerations. kVp is a means of controlling motion. I think I mentioned this in the previous video, and that is that you've got your 15% rule, and with the 15% rule, you've got options. So as you increase your kVp, if you have an issue with a patient who can't be still, you can use kVp as a means of controlling motion. So what you would do is increase your kVp by 15%. You're using your 15% rule, and you would decrease your mass, but specifically you would use time in that. So instead of just decreasing overall mass, cutting your MA in half or anything like that, what you would do is you would decrease your time by a factor of 2. So where we most commonly use this would be on portables, and in portables you can't select MA and time separately. So what you do on portables then is that you set mass. It has a mass timer. It has a set MA, usually a 100 MA. So when you're setting your overall mass, what you're actually selecting is time. So if you have a patient who's on a vent and the vent's moving pretty quickly, and you don't think that you can make let's say an abdomen exposure, let's say it's a larger patient where you might use 100 mass, and you can't get lack of motion with a 1 second exposure, what you could do is increase your kVp by 15% and reduce your mass by half. So mass exposures, sometimes with your pediatric patients who can't be still, that's a good option as well. Also, whenever you're phototiming, the same thing is going to happen. If you increase your kVp, then your mass is naturally going to decrease. Your machine is going to be set with a specific MA station. So what you're actually doing as you increase your MA is you're reducing mass, but specifically time. So if you're a student and you set your exposure factors, I'm going to tell on your technologists here, but if you're setting your exposure factors and you set a specific kVp and your phototime, and the technologist comes in and they look at your kVp, let's say you're doing a chest x-ray on a hypersonic patient, and they look at your control panel and you have 110 kVp set, and they increase your kVp to, I don't know, say 115. And they look at you and they say, it's going to be too light if you shoot at 110. They're absolutely inaccurate, because what's going to happen is at the lower kVp, what you're going to get is a longer exposure time. Your exposure index number is going to be identical. So the only thing that's really going to change is, one, your exposure time, and two, the interaction types inside of the patient. What you're going to get is more penetrating x-ray beam, which is safer for the patient, it's better for the patient. But fundamentally, as far as image creation goes, changing the kVp didn't do anything, or wouldn't do anything in that context. So the other thing that we have to consider, though, is if kVp gets too high and mass gets too low, then we might introduce quantum model. If you're familiar with some of my other videos, I have my students do experiments in their sophomore year where they play with technical factors and present their findings to the class. And quantum model is one of those things that for the last 2 years, none of my students have been able to demonstrate. So it may be that our image receptors are becoming sensitive enough that the quantum model is potentially a thing of the past. So still other considerations, we just talked about this, increasing kVp while you're phototiming doesn't really do anything except for decrease mass, and specifically what that's going to do is decrease the exposure time. It increases penetration, but it really isn't going to do anything to the exposure to image receptor. So what's the best technique for the equipment? And remembering that the main thing that will limit tube life is heat. The things that cause heat to limit tube life would be burning out the filament because of heat. The filament gets too hot, it burns out. Before it does that, it coats the inside of the x-ray tube, and it creates what we refer to as tanning. It has metal on the inside of the in this case, in the scenario I'm going to use, the glass envelope. If it does that, then you have an increased chance in the electrons not traveling from cathode to anode, but from the cathode to the glass, and that's what we refer to as arcing. And arcing will, it's a short circuit essentially, and it kills your x-ray tube right away. If the heat gets down to the bearings that the anode rotates on, then it can cause those bearings, the oil and the lubrication of those bearings, to dry up, disappear, so to speak. And what we wind up then is with this grounding sound that eventually will cause the anode to stop, and then we've got a stationary anode. With a stationary anode, what we can do is melt the face of the anode and create what we refer to as pitting, which is going to cause some irregularities in density and probably some issues with sharpness or recorded detail. Also, if you make an exposure, a high mass exposure on a cold target, it has the same effect as throwing hot water on a frosty windshield, and it could potentially break your anode. So all of those have to do with heat, and the main driver of heat is mass. So if we can increase kVp, we can reduce mass, and we can save dose, or we can save heat to the x-ray tube and extend the tube life. Also, though, the same type of techniques that are better for your patient are your high kVp, low mass techniques, providing the increase in kVp and decrease in mass doesn't cause quantum mottle, which is a noise, or excessive fog that would negatively impact the image receptor. Then high kVp, low mass techniques are better for the patient. So what's good for the tube is also good for the patient as well. So things that don't really apply all that much is kVp is what we used to use to control contrast, and really what controls contrast now is our computer algorithm. You can get your kVp or your mass high or low enough that it could negatively affect your contrast, but that's really in the extremes. For the most part, within a reasonable exposure factor range, kVp is not going to affect your contrast all that much. So it does change your differential absorption, but your computer algorithm is what's going to take the input that you provide your image receptor, and it's going to try to make your x-ray look ideal. This concludes the three-part series on kVp. I may do another one on MA in time eventually, and also another one on SID as exposure factor, source to image receptor distance. If you're having a hard time wrapping your mind around this three-part series on kVp, the reason for that is that this is a portion of image creation. Image creation is probably the most complicated portion of the X-ray curriculum, and it is kVp is the most difficult portion of that portion of the curriculum. So it's a very complicated subject. So I hope this was helpful to you. My intention was to try to give you a full understanding of what kVp, a full and practical understanding of what it is that kVp controls, how we control kVp, and how we can utilize kVp to best make an image, best care for our patients, and also best take care of our equipment. So if you found this to be helpful, please like, subscribe, and share.